Hello there. I recently had the privilege of guest curating a temporary exhibit at the Dundas Museum and Archives. The exhibit is closing today, so before tearing down, I thought I would make a recording for posterity and sharing purposes. I'd like to thank the Dundas Museum and Archives for facilitating this exhibit, as well as Austin Strutt for help with the graphic design of the plaques. Aquientor, Reconstructing the Forgotten Armour of the Precolonial Iroquoians, by Malcolm Gayahago Paulus Lines. The illustration shown here is a depiction of a Huron warrior in a suit of armor. This copperplate engraving was included in Les Voyages de Samuel de Champlain, which were a set of memoirs published by the French explorer in 1619. This engraving, which was a copy of a sketch by Champlain himself, has the distinction of being the only period depiction of the armor of the eastern woodlands, and is thus one of only a handful of visual references for armor within the period, as the armor ceased production 400 years ago, and the material culture of the time, wood and leather, does not lend itself well to archaeological preservation. The illustration, and the writings of Champlain and several other early authors, present us with a window into a very brief period of history in which the early explorers could observe the pre-colonial world before they inevitably altered it. It is notable that the image it presents bears very little resemblance to the standard conception. The common conception of the indigenous warrior was formed primarily of the exaggeration of dime novels and Hollywood westerns, and, much like said films and novels, this common conception is itself a fiction. What truth there is within the standard conception is anachronistic, a post-colonial image projected backwards onto the pre-colonial world. The guerrilla warfare of the eastern woodlands, the whooping bonsai charge of western cliché, were both responses to the changing face of warfare brought about by firearms. The former, an attempt to minimize exposure to fire, to mitigate the lethality of musket warfare and win with as few casualties as possible. The latter, a recognition and acceptance of the randomness of death in the face of musketry, a technique for dealing with muskets when you have none of your own. Both stereotypical tactics were generated within a specifically post-colonial context. In reality, the character of warfare prior to colonialism and the introduction of the musket was more aptly comparable to the character of the warfare of classical antiquity, of shield walls and armored warriors standing proud in good battle line. And unfortunately, little of this history has survived, as the window of opportunity through which the early explorers and writers could view the pre-colonial world before it changed in response to them was very brief. In this exhibit, I would like to share some of the history of this subject and my process of researching it. The armor. The armor was known as Aquientor in the Huron-Wendat language. Translated literally, this means it covers with sticks. Its names in other indigenous languages have been lost. It was woven like a piece of cloth, with wooden slats or rods acting in place of the warp threads. The wood provided rigid protection to take the velocity out of arrows and to distribute the impact of clubs, while the cords protected the slats, preventing them from being split or cracked by weapons. In my tests, I have found that the armor would have provided excellent protection from arrows and hand-to-hand weapons, even those of European steel. However, as attested by Champlain and the armor's subsequent extinction, it was of no use against musketry. The backplate. The backplate is a versatile piece of equipment. The wings are articulated with leather straps such that they can move with the arms and be used to cover the sides of the body and the face, perhaps when advancing against arrows. The backplate can also be removed and held by the shoulder straps to be used like a large shield, or placed on the ground and propped up by the wings like a pavise, tower shield, or small mantlet, portable wall. Perhaps one would do this when laying siege to a fortification. In addition, the oversized backplate may also have served to protect a second line of less well-armored warriors from arrows, while they in turn shot arrows and threw rocks over the heads of the front rank. In this application, the back shield would also protect the front rank from friendly fire, allowing the rear rank to continue fighting. The cuirass. The cuirass is composed of 3 elements, a breastplate, a backplate, and a fald, apron, to protect the abdomen and thighs. The pieces are separate to allow for mobility. When the legs are raised, the apron can lift under the breastplate. When struck, the breastplate quite effectively distributes the force of the blow into the apron and the backplate, thus lessening the impact to the body. Materials. It is likely the armor was made from ash wood, as ash provides a very good strength-to-weight ratio, being lighter and less brittle than most comparable hardwoods and also being easier to work. This recreation is, for budgetary reasons, made from a combination of ash, hickory, and oak. All are local hardwoods of similar strength. It is possible that the backplate was made from softwood to cut down on weight, as the backplate is less likely to be struck than the breastplate. Softwood is less durable than hardwood but weighs considerably less. This recreation therefore uses pine for the backplate. Cedar would have been a better choice as it is lighter and attested in shield construction. Through my tests, I determined that the ideal thickness for the slats is 3/8 of an inch, 1 centimeter, with the minimum functional thickness being 1/4 of an inch and the maximum without the bulk causing problems being 1/2 an inch, 6 millimeter to 12.5 millimeters. The exact fiber of the historic cordage is not known. Champlain describes it as cotton, which is unlikely as it does not grow in the region. And while it could have been traded for, I can't see someone going to such pains when there are local options. More likely it would have been made from milkweed and or dogbane, which are locally grown bast fibers. This might align with Champlain's description, as one plant fiber cord is easily mistaken for another. Another possibility is sinew cordage, which looks similar enough to plant fibers and is much stronger. Rawhide or leather are also possible, although I consider it less likely that Champlain could have mistaken these for cotton. They also don't work as well, as leather cords are thicker, meaning that the weaving can't be made as dense. Most of this recreation uses sisal garden twine, because I bought a spool without reading the label, because I'm an idiot, and decided to use it anyway, because I'm cheap. Sisal, as a Mexican leaf fiber, is dead wrong, but it serves to give a decent visual impression. The side plates of the armor are woven with hemp, which is also wrong, but it is of very similar character to what would have been used historically, hemp and dogbane both being bast fibers. The shin guards. The shin guards and helmet are constructed differently from the breastplate, as you can see in the illustration. Their construction methods are not known for certain, as there are no clear parallels from other cultures from which to draw. The shin guards here are speculative. No written description of their construction has survived, and while we lack a useful literary description of the shin guards, we are fortunate that the illustration is fairly easy to decipher. After trying out several of the limited possibilities, I was able to arrive at one that worked. Rather than being woven like the breastplate, the shin guards are sewn together through holes bored in the slats. These holes are staggered so as to avoid overly weakening any given section. The edges of the slats are also chamfered to allow the armor to conform to the leg with minimal gaps for arrows to exploit. The reason for this difference relative to the breastplate is to create a more rigid shell-like defense to protect the vulnerable shin bones from impacts. The trade-off is that the shin guards are a little more fragile to arrows than the breastplate. It is likely there was a leather or rawhide liner sewn into the shin guards, as this would make them more durable and comfortable, but this is pure speculation. These shin guards use oak slats. It is possible the historical examples would have used a split-resistant wood like elm, as without the weaving, this method of construction is more vulnerable than the rest of the armor to being split by arrows. This is again just speculation. This screen played a brief video. A brief demonstration of wooden slat armor. The armor plates are woven like a piece of cloth. I am using a simple plain weave over and under and over and under. The only difference between it and a piece of cloth is that I'm using ash wood instead of warp threads. I'm weaving with bast fiber twine, in this case hemp. The weaving takes many hours. A small panel like this takes about half a day. It's important to weave as tightly as possible, as this is going to determine the strength of the armor. It's also important that the tension remains even, otherwise the armor will buckle. A great many meters of twine are needed. Here we see the finished panel ready for testing. The weaving prevents the wooden slats from being split by arrows. For comparison, I will first demonstrate by splitting a piece of bare hardwood. Antler arrowheads are particularly good at splitting boards. The arrow acted as a splitting wedge, forcing the grain apart and splitting the edge off of the board. Now we will try the arrow against the woven slat armor. The weaving holds the wood together, preventing it from splitting. Being unable to force itself through, the force of the arrow was directed sideways, breaking the shaft below the head. Stone arrows tend to be too brittle to do any real damage. This arrow got lucky and was cushioned by striking a gap. It was unable to force itself through and part of the edge broke off. It did not survive a second shot, this time breaking at the tip and at the base. Steel broadheads fare better, but the armor still offers decent protection. The arrow perfectly struck a gap between two slats. It penetrated about 1.5 inches, but the weaving prevented the boards from opening wide enough to accept the shaft. This time the arrow struck a board directly and only penetrated about 1/8 of an inch. The arrow also broke just below the head. The armor also fares surprisingly well against steel cutting weapons like axes. The damage looks worse than it is. While some of the cords have been cut, the slats themselves sustained no significant damage. Apart from some loose ends, the armor remains intact on the inside. It would take a lot of hits before the armor disintegrated. Thank you for watching. On researching and recreating Iroquoian armor. In researching this subject, I was frustrated to learn that there are no surviving examples of this armor from anywhere in the eastern half of the continent. I was further frustrated to learn that the somewhat paltry illustration by Champlain is the only surviving period depiction of this armor. Nevertheless, I was curious and desired to know what this armor would have looked like in the flesh. In researching wooden armor, I stumbled across pictures of a museum exhibit by a Tlingit carver called Tommy Joseph. He had produced a number of reproductions of Tlingit and Pacific Northwest armors. I said to myself, that's what I'm going to do. I had previously come into contact with a process known as experimental archaeology, having attended several lectures by members of the Dark Ages Recreation Company, DARC, at the Forward into the Past conference hosted at the University of Waterloo. These people had attempted to recreate Dark Age bloomery furnaces through experimental archaeology, using iterative design founded upon what little was known for certain, until they produced an iron bloom that matched the target artifact. I decided to take a similar approach, recreating a test panel, subjecting it to destructive tests, and then slowly iterating in order to find out what works, as scientifically as I was able. However, before this I needed research so that I would have something to work with. Better to start with something than to start with nothing. So I began with a literature review. That is, I started by reading everything that had been written on the subject. That is, checking the local libraries, followed by a Google search of every possible combination of keywords, and the reading of every potentially useful result, followed by a repeat using different search engines, which did indeed turn up new results, followed by a scouring of the online collections of notable museums. Of particular usefulness in finding sources was a book, Native North American Armor, Shields, and Fortifications, 2004, by David Jones. This book laid much of the groundwork for a literature review, pointing me in the direction of most of the primary sources and a number of secondary and tertiary sources. Direct references that I could find were the writings of several early explorers and Jesuit missionaries, chief among which were Champlain's previously related account and illustration, seen to the right. The most useful descriptions besides Champlain's are below. From Voyages au Canada by the explorer Jacques Cartier. They were armed up to the fingers, wearing armor that was of strings and of wood, and were laced and woven together. From the Jesuit missionary Joseph Lafitau. Their breastplates were also a fabric of wood or little wands, cut in proportional lengths, clasped against one another, twined and woven very neatly with little cords made of antelope or deerskin. They had thigh and arm guards of the same material. From Le Grand Voyage de Paix de Huron, by the missionary Gabriel Sagard. They also wear a sort of armor and breastplate which they call Aquientor on their backs and legs and other parts of their body to defend themselves from the blows of arrows. These cuirasses are made from white rods cut to measure and tightened the one against the other, sewn and intertwined with cords very tightly and neatly. Other sources. Other, less descriptive mentions can be found among a number of early writers in reference to a variety of cultures and regions, leading me to speculate that similar armor was used by most, if not all, cultures in the eastern woodlands. In terms of indirect references, those with useful similarities but no direct bearing, I was able to reference surviving examples of wood and string armors from the Pacific coast, such as the aforementioned Tlingit examples as well as Haida examples such as the one to the right. Other sources were the pre-Columbian effigy pipes, carved stone or clay pipeheads. The Iroquoian examples were of limited usefulness, as they generally only depict the head, and those helmets that are depicted show a very different style from Champlain's illustration. However, several Mississippian pipeheads, like those below, depicted an armored figure in full, and while these are too far removed geographically and temporally to serve as a direct reference, they were close enough geographically and temporally that it is plausible there would be similarities of material culture. Methodology. Having finished my research, I began to conduct experimental archaeology. I decided that my recreation needed to match Champlain's illustration and descriptions reasonably well. Additionally, it needed to be feasible to construct in the period, also to provide a life-saving degree of protection against the weapons of the period, while also allowing enough mobility to run and fight while wearing. This was my criteria. The materials were simple enough. The literary sources describe wood and cord. There is no reason to question this. An acquaintance suggested antler, but this not only disagrees with the sources, it also raises the question of, why hasn't this armor survived? Wood rots fast, antler survives much better in the ground. So if the armor was indeed made from antler, we would be much more likely to have a surviving example. I next needed to come up with a construction technique. To determine this, I created small panels of armor and tested them against various weapons, both period weapons of stone, antler, and wood, as well as medieval weapons of steel for curiosity's sake. With each iteration, I changed one element until I found a construction technique that I was satisfied with, one that looked reasonably close and was able to withstand the tests, particularly the arrow tests. A selection of those test panels can be seen above, with photos having been taken before and after destructive tests. Ultimately, I found that the style of woven armor used in the Pacific Northwest is the only real possibility. Despite it occurring on the other side of the continent, it matches the illustration reasonably well, and while not a perfect visual match, other styles of construction with the specified materials either do not match any better or else do not work very well, thus excluding them from consideration. After I had determined the materials, I proceeded to make a mock-up of each armor component out of cardboard based on the illustration. In order to determine the shapes of each element as well as the strap placement, such that I could develop a configuration that both looked right and didn't restrict movement too badly. This told me several things that the illustration could not. First, there is the question of whether the lower portion of the armor is an apron or a full wraparound skirt. In creating a mock-up, I was able to learn that a skirt doesn't work, as you can't run in it, and it knocks up against the back of the legs uncomfortably as you move. It also allows me to contradict the illustration. in which the apron appears to reach up to chest height. In testing, however, this style simply doesn't work. If the armor is worn such, you can't raise your legs or bend over. Once I had determined the specifics of the design, it was time to finally construct the recreation, which you can see on the mannequin. The process thus far is what one might refer to as experimental archaeology, where one attempts to answer a historical question by recreating the past. In this case, what did Iroquoian armor look like in the flesh? And how well did this armor perform against the weapons of the day? Once the armor was completed, a related process known as experiential archaeology could be conducted. This is where you make use of historical technology in order to discover what it was like to use. This can allow you to speculate about various elements of its construction, as well as its role in the context of the period. This, for instance, aids in speculation about the function and role of otherwise inexplicable pieces like the backplate. It also presents new questions and answers to questions you hadn't thought to ask. For instance, my initial recreation excluded side plates, as I was trying to be as scientific as possible and couldn't definitively prove their existence. I have changed my mind since then and added side plates, as in wearing the armor, I found that the sides of the chest were often vulnerable. The addition of the side plates improved not only the coverage of the armor, but the protective value of the original pieces as well as their movement. As with the side plates installed, any blows to the chest are transferred partially into the backplate. The side plates also solved an issue I was having where the breastplate annoyingly flapped when you leaned forward. That the side plates improved the armor so significantly without any real drawbacks tells me that the original certainly featured something similar, even though the illustration doesn't explicitly agree. Through these processes of experiment and experience, I have attempted to research and refine and expand what is known about this niche subject. And that is the story of my research process regarding Iroquoian armor. I hope that you find this exhibit interesting. Thank you. I made this small panel for the public to handle, so that they could feel not only the weight of the armor but also how it moves and flexes. On shields. Shields were abandoned along with the use of body armor in the wake of musketry. There seem to have been a variety of styles in use. I have included several recreations. From Lafitau. Their shields were of willow or bark, covered over with one or many skins. Some were of very thick skin. They were of all shapes and sizes. From Sagard. They make shields of cedar which cover almost the entire body, and others of leather. Two brief mentions from Champlain. They carry a round shield of dressed leather made from an animal like a buffalo. Their shields are made of wood and elk leather. From the Jesuit Relations. They make their shields of hewn wood, principally cedar, with slightly curving edges, light, long, and wide so that they cover the entire body. Next, in order that they may not be completely pierced and split by blows, they sew them inwards with cords of woven animal skins, which surrounds and connects the whole mass of the shield. This seems to describe a similar construction method to the slat armor. A description of a Montagnais, Innu, shield from the Jesuit Relations. He carried with him a great shield, very long and very wide. It easily covered my whole body, and reached from my feet to my chest. They raise it up and entirely cover themselves with it. It is made of one single piece of very light cedar. I do not know how they can plane so large and wide a plank with their knives. It was a little bent or curved, the better to cover the body, and, in order that if an arrow or blow should split it, it might still hold together, it was sewed at the top and bottom with a leather string. Side note 1. In Lafitau's reference, the word willow is a weak translation, which might mean willow specifically, or it might mean hazel, withy, rod, dowel, wattle, or even woven ash. Side note 2. In Champlain's reference, the word elk might refer to either moose or wapiti, moose being more likely due to geography. Side note 3. It is possible that the first cited Jesuit reference, as well as Sagard's reference, are paraphrasing the Jesuit reference to the Montagne shield. On the buckler recreation, small round shield. This shield was constructed by baking a piece of heavy, wet rawhide over a pit filled with embers. The heat causes the skin to harden and contract, while the wet prevents the skin from burning. If done properly, this will cause the skin to thicken to several millimeters and harden like plastic. I used a technique from 18th century descriptions of plains shields. I don't know if this technique would have been used over here, but it's a simple enough process that it's not implausible. I could have done better in manufacturing my recreation. I scorched the leather in several places, and the overall piece is warped and ugly. It turns out making shields takes skill. Who would have thought it? But it works well in spite of its appearance, and no doubt some historical person made similar mistakes to mine. Historically, these shields would have been made from buffalo or moose, as described by Champlain. In this case, I used cow as a substitute. Poor man's buffalo. Cow is thinner and weaker than buffalo, but it's close enough for jazz. On the heater shield recreation, teardrop-shaped shield. This shield is based on one from Champlain's Illustrations of Algonquin Dress and is made from several planks of pine, which have been tied together according to the shield in the illustration. The front has been covered with rawhide, as per Champlain's second description. The hide makes the shield both stronger and lighter than if it were made solely of wood. Without it, the shield would need to be quite thick and heavy to resist arrows. The shield should probably have been made from cedar planks, as these are lighter than pine and attested by Sagard and the Jesuits, but oh well, pine is what I had to hand. The front has been painted with a simple pattern. This is speculative, but I think it's likely that the shield faces would have been painted. On the helmet. The helmet is an unknown factor. The illustration is hard to decipher due to lack of skill on the artist's part, and the sole literary reference is poor, reading as follows. They had helmets of the same material. Lafitau. From this, we know that the helmets were made of wood and string, but the details of the construction are left vague. I have included 3 possible reconstructions in this exhibit. All have, at their core, a Gastoa frame, the frame of a headdress worn with modern-day Six Nations regalia. These are composed of bent ashwood splints and are of suspiciously sturdy construction considering their present-day application. I speculate that the Gastoa is a vestigial element that survived as ceremonial attire after armor was abandoned. The reconstruction on the lightly armored mannequin draws from the conquering warrior pipehead, seen at the bottom, as well as certain Ontario Iroquoian pipeheads. Here the helmet is constructed from a ring of slat armor, sewn onto a Gastoa frame with a cap of doubled leather. The woven slats protect from arrows and most blows. The higher front prevents blows from striking the top of the head, while the leather provides a last line of defense in case those fail. The issue with this reconstruction is that it doesn't match Champlain's illustration. We can say with certainty that this type was used, as it matches the pipeheads, but it was certainly not the only type used. The first recreation in the display case interprets Champlain's illustration using the boar tusk helmets of the Mycenaean Greeks as reference material, as their helmets, example seen to the right, look quite similar to Champlain's illustration. This interpretation is constructed from a series of small oak plates, neatly chamfered and fitted so as to deflect arrows. The high peak of the helmet can deflect downward blows and also act as a crumple zone for any club blows that are not deflected. There are 2 main issues with this reconstruction. First, that it draws primarily from helmets of another continent. This is not implausible, but it is nevertheless overly speculative. Second, it can be pierced by a direct shot from an antler-tipped arrow. The second reconstruction in the display case attempts to interpret the illustration as consisting of 2 components, a lower crown of woven slats, similar to the first example, and an upper of something else, in this case taking literally Lafitau's description of helmets of the same material as the armor, by using more woven slats. I consider the overall concept of this reconstruction to be plausible, but unfortunately this attempt doesn't match the illustration. The helmet on the heavily armored mannequin takes a very different approach with regards to the upper. Having noted that the crown of the previous slat armor helmets would be sufficient to protect against projectiles, I theorized that the upper could be made from a wider variety of materials, as it would only have to protect against downward melee blows. Someone made the suggestion that the upper could be made from a coil of rope, like certain medieval helmets, examples shown. I discounted this possibility, as it doesn't match the illustration well. Nevertheless, the idea was inspiring, and I decided to experiment along similar lines. This example is made from a series of hoops of twisted corn husk wrapped in leather and stacked on top of the other on the frame. The plume is braided corn husk wrapped around the frame and stuffed through the hoops, friction holding everything in place. This construction is well suited, as it provides cushioning from blunt force. It is quite possible that the materials are inaccurate. This sort of upper could be made from any number of materials, birch bark, rawhide, reeds, grass, etc. I think this concept is the most likely of the three interpretations, as it matches the illustration quite well and is the most functional of my recreations. Regardless, it still might not be correct. And unless by some miracle we find a surviving example, we don't ever get to know with certainty. On the lighter armor. The second mannequin features a speculative set of light armor, such as might have been worn by younger, less experienced warriors who hadn't yet made a full suit of wood and cord. Those who were expected to act as skirmishers and scouts rather than frontline fighters. The mannequin is equipped with a helmet of less robust construction, as described on a previous panel, as well as a coat of leather armor. The leather armor is made from several layers of thick leather. It is likely moose would have been the preferred choice of leather. This armor could also have been worn underneath the wooden armor to serve as padding. The leather armor is not attested by any direct sources for this region, nor are there any surviving examples. However, I think it's certain that something like this was used in the region, as the wooden slat armor is improved significantly by the addition of an undercoat for cushioning, and as similar leather armors were used all across the northern half of the continent, both as under armor as well as standalone armors. The pattern is just a simple sleeveless tunic, but with a toggle at the shoulder to make it easier to wear over heavy clothing. This pattern is speculative, being the simplest solution I could come up with. I think it is usually best to keep things as simple as possible when speculating. The leather provides some protection from blunt force, but would be insufficient against heavy blows. It is also capable of stopping a decent percentage of arrows when it is worn loosely. Arrows that strike at any angle besides 90 degrees will bite into the leather and are then turned as the leather moves with the impact, often breaking stone tips in the process. However, if an arrow strikes well, it can penetrate and wound the wearer, though the wounds would be lessened in the process. Additional layers of leather improve the armor exponentially, as there are more folds to move and turn an arrow. When worn under the wooden armor, the combination is formidable. Any arrows that manage to get through a weak point in the wood are stopped by the leather. The leather also serves well to reduce blunt force. The wood takes the sharp part of the impact and the leather takes the rest. The breastplate forces the leather to compress evenly when struck, meaning that a great volume of air must be forced out before the impact can reach the body. Pictured: an assortment of Haida and Tlingit leather armors from the Pacific Northwest. On bows. The character of pre-Columbian bows is not known for certain, as none from this time period and region have survived. The bows that have survived date from the 1700s and later, and existed within a different context from their predecessors. By the mid-1600s, the musket had almost entirely replaced the bow and arrow in warfare. These post-contact bows tend to be between 20 and 50-pound draw weights and between 4 and 5.5 feet long. Pre-contact bows existed in a world where the bow and arrow was a primary weapon of war, a world where warriors were equipped with arrow-proof armor and shields. Post-contact bows existed in a time when people mostly fought with muskets and where armor had been rendered obsolete. In short, the post-contact bows are just meant for hunting, whereas pre-contact bows might have had to deal with things that are much tougher than animal skin. Early descriptions of indigenous archery describe bows of about 7 feet in length, the width of an arm, and considerable power. It's likely they drew at about 100 pounds, as this seems to be a global standard for war bows. Short bows were also used for war. These were of similar draw weight, but used a much shorter draw length, as shorter bow limbs are under greater strain when drawn to the same length. Having a shorter draw, these were primarily used for skirmishing, quick hit-and-run attacks in the lead-up to a battle, where the short draw length becomes a strength, as it's much easier to run with a half-drawn bow than fully drawn. The example in the case is a scalloped bow. The scallops are just decorative, a way for the bowyer to show off his skill. If made correctly, they don't affect the performance. Arrows were worn in a back quiver. Often these were made from birch bark or else of animal fur for waterproofing. If a suit of armor was worn, it was difficult to draw an arrow over the shoulder, so instead the quiver would be worn like a necklace, with the arrows resting against the breast. On arrows. Arrow shafts were commonly made of red osier dogwood, of cedar, or of ash suckers. They were fletched with goose or turkey feathers, or occasionally eagle. Several types of arrowhead were used in the period: slate, flint, and antler. Slate arrows were the easiest to manufacture, but were fragile and not as sharp. Flint/chert arrows were sharper and stronger than slate, but required considerable skill to produce, and flint was not available in all regions, sometimes requiring import. The Neutrals, who originally inhabited the Dundas region, chose the location partly for its proximity to flint deposits in the Niagara Escarpment. Stone arrows were preferred for hunting, as they can have broad heads with cutting edges, which would allow a wounded deer to bleed more freely. However, stone is also quite brittle, making stone arrows poorly suited to warfare. When a stone arrow strikes a piece of armor, or a shield, or even sometimes heavy leather clothing, it shatters harmlessly. One could imagine that a well-used suit of armor might have dozens of fragments of stone embedded in the surface of the wood. Antler arrows were, as you might expect, made from the points of antlers. They are extremely time-consuming to produce with stone tools. They also lack a cutting edge and are only slightly larger than the arrow shaft, meaning that they are poor for severing blood vessels, and the shaft will plug up any wounds and limit blood loss. Their only real advantage then is their durability. I believe antler arrows were intended primarily for war. Unlike stone points, their durability allows them to survive impact with armor and shields. If, for instance, a piece of wooden armor is poorly made, or damaged from previous encounters, the antler arrows can split the boards and pass through several inches. The lower lethality of the antler tips is also not an issue in warfare, where a wounded enemy burdens the enemy forces more than a slain enemy. Indigenous copper. Examples of authentic pre-colonial copper tools. A hand-hammered copper axe head and knife from the collection of the Dundas Museum and Archives. On copper weapons and tools. Native copper is a form that naturally occurs in a pure and readily usable state, requiring no smelting and little processing. While the ability to smelt copper from ore, copper oxide within rocks, was not known in the northern part of the continent, this naturally pure form of copper was utilized widely. Quotation from Champlain. One of their chiefs drew from a sack a piece of copper about a foot long which he gave to me. He said that they gathered it in lumps and having melted it, spread it in sheets, smoothing it with stones. From Cartier. They gave the Lord a great knife of red copper that cometh from Saguenay. Native copper is quite scarce. There are only a few locations where it occurs in great volume. Consequently, in the territory of Iroquoian people, copper was rare and highly valued, a much sought trade good for tools and jewelry. Besides its obvious utility, copper was thought to have certain medicinal properties. Most people would have some small pieces of copper jewelry, either a few beads on a necklace or a small, well-polished lump to carry in a medicine pouch. Some copper tools were relatively common, like awls and needles, as these require very little metal. Larger copper tools, such as knives, spear points, and axes, were rare treasures to be cared for and handed down between generations. Unfortunately, relatively few of these pre-Columbian copper tools have survived to the present day, particularly those of later manufacture. While copper generally survives well in the ground, it is unfortunately easy to recycle. It is thought that many copper artifacts were melted for scrap in the 1700s and 1800s, European pioneers failing to recognize the significance of the artifacts they were plowing up. In this exhibit there are several originals and some recreations. Copper axes like these would have been uncommon. There might only have been a couple in any given village. On knives. Daggers in the period were made from wood or bone. Though these are nothing like as sharp as flint, the fragility of flint made it difficult to produce a stone blade that was long enough for combat. Wooden daggers would be hardened in fire. It is likely they were made of ironwood, like the smaller of these two recreations, or else of some other dense hardwood. These weapons would be used as a last resort if the primary weapons were broken, or the battle devolved into grappling. Besides wood, daggers could also be made from the split leg bone of a deer, or in rare cases from copper. On war picks. War picks are not mentioned in any source I have read, but one is depicted in Champlain's illustration, and several surviving antler pickaxes have been found in neighboring regions. The pick is constructed from a piece of antler. A hole is bored through a wide section of the antler to admit the handle. War picks are neither heavy enough nor sharp enough to damage the armor, but it is possible they were used to strike at gaps in the armor, such as at the collar or the knees, or perhaps to hook a shield and leave an opponent open for one of your allies to strike. On war clubs. There were two types of war club, the ball head and the gun stock. These had different strengths and were used based on personal preference. The term war club is an English phrase meant to distinguish those clubs meant for war from all those other types of regular everyday clubs. Contrary to the standard conception of blunt weapons, war clubs were fairly nimble weapons, handling more like a sword than a sledgehammer. Ball-head war clubs are named such for obvious reasons. These were constructed from a root ball or a burl. The reason for this has to do with the grain structure of the wood and the durability that derives from it. If they were constructed instead from a straight-grained section of trunk, the head of the club would be liable to break off during impact. Ball-head clubs were designed to minimize the glancing blow. When a circular object strikes another circular object, even if the angle is quite steep, it will still transfer a fair bit of energy. Imagine pool balls colliding. Even a glancing impact will send the balls flying. Ball-head clubs were often heavily carved, sometimes with animals, particularly otters, as well as geometric patterns or faces. This example has a wolf carved into the spine to represent the clan animal of the maker. Carvings themselves are obviously fragile, and some may make the club a little less durable, but if done skillfully, they don't weaken the club to any significant degree. This example is made from elm, which was one of the preferred woods as the grain structure of the wood is twisted and interlocking, which helps prevent cracking and splitting. Gunstock clubs are poorly named, leading to the misconception that they were made to mimic the shape of a gun and are thus a post-contact development. This is incorrect. The early explorers mention indigenous warriors as wielding flat-edged truncheons shaped like a falchion, see endnote, and other similar descriptions. This is a decent enough description of what we would call a gunstock club. Earlier examples seem to have lacked any kind of spike. Later examples often incorporated the blade of a trade knife. A theory of the spike is that it is for dealing with muskets. Draw in too close for the musket to be fired and apply the spike. The shape of the club also seems to have changed somewhat as time went by. Two reproductions are included here. One is an approximation of a pre-Columbian club. The other is a reproduction of the sort that was used in the mid-1700s. I will concede that it is possible the change in shape was to make the clubs look more like gun stocks. The shape of the club is designed to concentrate impact on a small surface, inflicting worse injuries. The drawback is that the thin contact area was more likely to deal a glancing blow. Gunstock clubs are a bit more nimble in the hand than ball-head clubs, their weight distribution being more even. Like the other type of club, the grain structure is important. These clubs were made from a crooked section of tree so that the grain would follow the shape of the club and avoid runout. The examples in the case are made from walnut, which was a common choice but not the best. Endnote: a falchion is a curved sword like the one in this illustration. Encounter at Lake Champlain. In 1609, the French explorer Samuel de Champlain, in an effort to strengthen bonds with his First Nations allies to help in the establishment of his burgeoning colony at Quebec, agreed to accompany his Huron, Wendat, and Algonquin, Omamewinini, allies, in a military expedition against their Iroquois, Haudenosaunee, enemies. After a journey, Champlain's party encountered an army of 200 Iroquois encamped by the shores of what he would name Lake Champlain. The Mohawk name for the region is Ganyadaleji Ganogalode, which loosely translates as something like the door of the country. The region at the time was a borderland, an intersection of the territory of several First Nations. The lake provided a convenient route running north-south between the St. Lawrence and the Hudson rivers, occupying a valley between the Adirondack Mountains on the west and the Green Mountains on the east. As such, it was often used as a trade route in times of peace, allowing one to avoid the mountain ranges as well as the unpredictable waters of Lake Ontario, and, being the most convenient route north-south, was also a frequent battleground in times of war, a convenient place to intercept an approaching force before they could enter the homeland. It was in this region that the coalition army engaged the Iroquois. An illustration of the battle from Champlain's memoirs is seen above. Champlain describes drawing within bowshot of the Iroquois. When they were armed and in array, they dispatched 2 canoes to the enemy to inquire if they wished to fight, to which the latter replied that they wanted nothing else. But they said that, at present, there was not much light, and that it would be better to wait for daylight, so as to be able to recognize each other, and that as soon as the sun rose, they would offer us battle. This was agreed to by our side. Meanwhile, the entire night was spent in dancing and singing on both sides, with many insults and other talk. Ours were not slow in retorting, telling them they would see such feats of arms as never before. As day broke, I saw the enemy go out of their barricade, nearly 200 in number, proud and rugged in appearance. They came at a slow pace towards us, with a dignity and assurance which much pleased me. Our men also advanced in the same order. They were equipped with armor woven from cotton thread and with wood, which was proof against their arrows. In his memoirs, Champlain included an illustration of a Huron warrior, seen previously. Champlain describes the battle thus: I rested the musket against my cheek, and aimed directly at one of the 3 chiefs and fired. With the same shot 2 of them fell to the ground, and another was so wounded that he died shortly thereafter. I had loaded my musket with 4 balls. The Iroquois were much astonished that 3 of their men had been killed so quickly and despite their armor. This caused great alarm among them. As I was loading again, one of my companions fired a shot from the woods, which astonished them anew to such a degree that seeing their chiefs dead, they lost courage and took to flight, abandoning their camp and fleeing into the woods, whither I pursued, killing yet more of them. After the battle, our men amused themselves by taking a great quantity of corn from the enemies, and also their armor, which they had cast aside that they might run better. Aftermath. This first encounter galvanized the Iroquois against the French, souring relations and leading to a century and a half of violence. It also taught the Iroquois that their armor was of little use against firearms, and consequently, within a few years of the battle, armor had fallen entirely out of use among the Iroquois. Its use persisted a little longer among French allied nations, and those further inland, as they were not forced to face the gun right away. But after a decade, many indigenous people had acquired firearms through trade or war with the colonists, and as a result, armor became extinct in the East by about 1630. The tactics and shape of battle rapidly changed as well. As Champlain demonstrated, if an enemy was equipped with even a few muskets, a battle line quickly becomes a costly maneuver, a cost which indigenous people were unwilling to pay, as it is no easy feat to convince men to stand in line and be gunned down after the fashion of early modern European linear warfare. Additionally, the population density of the New World could ill afford such casualty rates. Thus, the battle line and ritualized warfare were abandoned, along with the armor, in favor of the guerrilla tactics the general public might be more familiar with, taking shots from cover before changing position, or if that wasn't an option, waiting until the enemy had fired and was in the process of reloading before rushing in with an axe or a club. Firearms seem to have affected these changes extremely quickly among the Iroquois. A passage from the Jesuit Relations in 1616 helps illustrate the timeline of this change when contrasted with Champlain's account of 1609, or the 1610 account from the Jesuit Relations. They have the bow and shield or buckler, but they never place themselves in a line of battle, at least from what I have seen, and in truth, they are by nature very fearful and cowardly. This slightly racist excerpt also illustrates a common circular pattern of colonialism, characterized by a lack of self-awareness wherein the colonial power, after disrupting an established system, will then disparage the native people for suffering from or attempting to adapt to the new status quo. The colonial power then uses this newly generated low opinion as justification for further disruption, in a vicious cycle that would continue and repeat for centuries. On the nature of precolonial warfare. Most warfare at the time was highly ritualized. The primary sort of war was intended as a display of force and resolve, not intended to kill the opponent so much as to show the enemy that you are formidable, and that any committed attack against your territory will be costly. The lower degree of social hierarchy in the period made it infeasible to conscript through coercion. This in turn made men less willing to die for an abstract authority, which in turn helped to avoid all-out war, except in the case where it was thought that it could be won with few casualties. Under ordinary circumstances, only small nations with no friends, allies, or kinsmen, a rarity, were truly at risk of full-scale invasion. This ritualized sort of war, though frequent, usually involved very low casualties. A war might end with only a single battle, and those battles might end with only a few wounded on either side, or in some cases with none killed. They might be thought of as a training exercise, a show of force, a testing for weaknesses. From La Fetau. On occasions of this sort, their small number permits them to draw together, so to speak, body to body, and fight as in a duel, as the heroes of the Iliad and Aeneid did. Quite often they know each other and speak with each other. They ask each other news, harangue, insult, and pay each other compliments. Some wars were decided by dueling, rather than mass combat, the goals of the war being wagered on the outcome of the duel, with both parties agreeing to abide by the outcome. From the Jesuit Relations. Sometimes they decide their wars by single combat. Two bands, one of the so-called Montagnais, the other of Iroquois, had met a few years ago in readiness for battle. Their leaders had advanced and were already designating the positions of the formation of the lines of attack, when one thus addressed the other. "Let us spare the blood of our followers, nay, rather let us spare our own. Let us settle the matter with our bare hands, and he who overcomes the other shall be the victor." The proposition was accepted, and the two joined battle. On other wars. Other wars took the form of petty feuds. For instance, if a man was killed in a dispute between hunting parties, the chiefs would initially send emissaries to try and clear things up, perhaps demanding reparations or justice for the wronged party. From Sigard. One of their people had seriously wounded an Algonquin, and they had reconciled with them without war by means of a present, and only he who had done the mischief was held to be a cur and a villain, and not the others who were very sorry at the harm done. If neither reparations nor justice nor satisfactory explanation were forthcoming, the wronged party might gather a band of kinsmen to claim petty vengeance. If the perpetrator of this initial wrong was not an available target for this vengeance, the vigilantes might take out their anger on someone from his community, in which case the vendetta might spiral into a cycle of violence which could continue for several years, until the women of the villages got fed up and smacked some sense into their husbands and sons. These wars often consisted mostly of ambushes conducted against those who made themselves vulnerable by venturing too far from the safety of town: hunters, fishers, traders, travelers, etc. From Sigard. This warfare is, properly speaking, nothing but surprises and treachery. Because of the decentralized nature of this sort of war, it was hard to tell when it was safe to go out. In extreme cases, this could lead to famine, as the men were unable to go hunting or fishing for fear of being ambushed. In times like this, the men would often take up farming, working alongside their wives in the fields, not just for the extra labor, but also to protect the women while they were outside the village walls. On military maneuvers. From Mores des Sauvages Américains, compris Armour de Premier Temps, by the missionary Joseph Francois Lafitau. Although the Indians are well accustomed to fighting in the woods and running from tree to tree, they do not fail to comport themselves very well on the plain and in the open. They have even, among them, a way of exercising to make their military maneuvers, which shows that they do not fight out of order, and that they know how to keep their ranks. From The Voyages of Samuel de Champlain. The war chiefs take sticks a foot long, as many in number as they are, and signified their chiefs with somewhat larger sticks. Then clear a space 5 or 6 feet square, where the chief, as a sergeant major, puts all these sticks in order, as it seems good to him, then calls all his companions who come armed, and shows them the rank and order which they will have to observe in fighting their enemies. All the Indians regard attentively, noticing the design that the chief has made with these sticks, and afterwards withdraw, and begin to form ranks according to the plan shown by said sticks. Then they fall out, move around and return again into order, repeating this maneuver 2 or 3 times, and they all take their places without needing a sergeant major to keep them in their place, which they know very well how to keep without getting out of line. That is the rule which they have observed in warfare. Champlain's description implies a level of tactical complexity beyond the basic shield line, as there would be no need for such a demonstration to organize a simple linear formation. You can explain a battle line more quickly and effectively with words. One can imagine that maneuvers were an important part of wars. One could potentially win an engagement simply by outpositioning the opponent. On sieges and border wars. War was seldom brought directly to a town, as laying siege was a costly endeavor. The main occasion where this might occur was when a hostile group tried to establish an outpost or town in a border region, laying claim to what was previously shared hunting grounds, and thus threatening the subsistence model of the other nations who shared the region. This was rare, as unless the encroaching nation held a significant power advantage, the result would be destruction with no territorial changes. Hence the aforementioned ritualized warfare. Low-stakes sparring matches to show the opponent that expansionism isn't going to be worth their while. One wouldn't engage in a major war unless one was certain it could be won quickly and easily, as, win or lose, a costly war would leave one vulnerable to other neighbors. Fortified towns persisted through the changing face of warfare, lasting until the 1770s. However, they fared poorly when the attackers had greater firepower than the defenders. Muskets are much better suited to siege warfare than bows, as they can be loaded and fired from cover. This would become a major factor in the early stages of the Beaver Wars that consumed the 1600s. Thus concludes this virtual tour. Thank you.